This is World Civilization. My name is Dr. Long. This video is entitled The Industrial Revolution, and it will particularly focus on the early decades of the Industrial Revolution from the 1780s until the 1850s. We'll go a little bit beyond as well. Now, the Industrial Revolution is incredibly important to the modern world. It has changed the goods available, it has changed how we work, and it's changed where we live. Economically speaking, the Industrial Revolution is incredibly important to how we live in the modern world. The effects of the Industrial Revolution are still with us, particularly in nations that have industrialized or developing nations that are currently attempting to industrialize. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain in the 1780s. It was not a revolution that occurred overnight, but rather one that took place over several decades. The Industrial Revolution also spread to other parts of Europe and to the United States during the first half of the 19th century, and later has spread to other parts of the world as well. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, prior to the 1780s, the vast majority of people in the world were farmers. Goods were either made at home or by artisans or skilled craftsmen in workshops. Goods were more expensive and they were less common before the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution changed all of this. The Industrial Revolution changed the amount of goods available for purchase, and it changed the price. Goods became more available and the price fell. In nations that industrialized during the course of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution also led to a huge expansion of department stores. Department stores are stores with multiple departments such as women's clothing, men's clothing, houseware, and so forth. In cities, department stores often replaced small family-owned shops, and shopping options greatly increased. Now, as I mentioned, industrialization also changed how we work. Goods, instead of being made by artisans in workshops, are increasingly made in factories. And the workplace and the home become more separate as fewer goods are actually made at home. And it also changes, as I mentioned, where we live. More and more people begin living in cities instead of rural areas. Now, most everything you have today is made in factories, and this was not always the case. Now, for the Industrial Revolution to have occurred in the first place, beginning in the 1780s, several things had to happen first in Europe. The first, and arguably the sort of foundation of all this, was a change in agriculture. And this has been dubbed the Agricultural Revolution, which happened in the decades leading up to the Industrial Revolution. The Agricultural Revolution resulted because farmers in Europe were making better use of land, better use of fertilizer, and the end result was more food was available. Also, by the end of the 19th century, advances in shipping allowed for grain that was grown in the United States, in Russia, Canada, Australia, and so forth to be imported to Europe as well, further increasing the food supply. Now, the increase in the food supply had a dramatic effect on the population. People had better diets, their health improved, more children began living to adulthood. So between 1780 and 1914, there was an enormous population boom in Europe. To give you an example of this, in 1800, excluding Russia, the population of Europe was roughly 187 million people. By 1914, it had grown to 401 million. So from 187 in 1800 to 401 million in 1914. And this was also a time when Europe was sending out millions of immigrants from the British Isles, Germany, Italy, Russia, Poland, and so forth to the United States, Canada, Australia, and Argentina. Now, part of the great change of the Agricultural Revolution and the huge population explosion that it caused was an expansion in cities. The time period of the Industrial Revolution saw a rapid urbanization in Europe. Many people moved from the countryside to cities in search of jobs. Now, this happened in Europe, but it also happened in other countries that industrialized, such as the United States. And this changed where people live. For instance, by 1850, Great Britain became the first nation in the history of the world to have more people living in cities than living in the countryside. Now, this same process would happen in the United States and would occur by 1920. As I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain. And the first two large important industries in Great Britain were the textile industry and the iron industry. By the late 19th century, steel, chemicals, and petroleum would become important as well. Now, iron and textiles were the first two big industries in Britain, and iron was the main metal used for tools and machines. And as the population was growing, there was also a large demand for textiles, so this helped the textile industry grow. Now, British products were not only sold in Great Britain, but they were also sold around the world. So what were some of the factors that allowed the Industrial Revolution to happen in Britain and then later spread to other countries? What accounted for Britain's success? Well, there are a few major factors for this for Great Britain. First, Britain had a very pro-business atmosphere, one in which those who had new ideas, new businesses were encouraged to grow those. The regulation, the taxes were fairly low, and there was actually prestige to succeed in business in Great Britain. Second, Great Britain had large deposits of coal, particularly in northern England. And coal was the main fuel for factories, for railroads, and so forth, and so that gave them a ready-made fuel source. And you can think of the comparison today. Coal in the 19th century would be like oil today. You know, a country with a lot of oil would be rich in resources. Also, Great Britain was an innovator in technology. A number of inventions during the Industrial Revolution came in Great Britain. Probably the best example of this was the steam engine. You know, the first major engine that did not rely on water power. The steam engine was invented by James Watt, a British engineer and inventor, in 1781, and that revolutionized the use of engines. Lastly, there were new ways of working, more efficient ways of working. And this particularly has been described by Scottish economist Adam Smith. Adam Smith talks about what he calls the division of labor. Now, the division of labor is taking a task and dividing it into its smallest element and having everyone do part of it. So, for instance, prior to the Industrial Revolution, if you had an artisan working on a product, he would make that product from scratch, from the ground up. With the Industrial Revolution, the division of labor, you'll have an assembly line on factories eventually. And each stage in the production will be broken up into its smallest element. That improves efficiency and it will improve production. So factories are much more productive in the number of goods they can produce than an artisan's workshop. Likewise, Smith, and he describes all this in his book, The Wealth of Nations, talks about what's called economies of scale. As factories can produce more and more goods than an artisan in a workshop, they can also drop the price, which changes the market as well. Well, some other things that benefited Great Britain were things that facilitated trade, particularly transportation and communication developments. For instance, in 1804, British inventor George Stephenson invented the railroad. And the railroad absolutely revolutionized land transportation. It was much faster than travel by horse and buggy. You could move more people, move more goods, and it was actually more comfortable. By the 1840s and 1850s, many nations in the Western world experienced a boom in the construction of railroads. Railroads could travel at longer distances and were very, very popular in the 19th century. In addition to railroads, steamships would also likewise revolutionize water transportation. Steamships would do what railroads had done on land on water. Communications also greatly improved in this era. For instance, Samuel Morse, an American inventor in the 1840s, invented the telegraph, which was the first form of instant communication. Well, the Industrial Revolution spread from Britain to Northern Europe to the United States, and then began to spread to the rest of the world. And nations that industrialized certainly saw tremendous economic growth. However, there were negative aspects to the Industrial Revolution, so I want to talk about this here. On the negative side, factories that came out of the Industrial Revolution polluted the environment terribly. There's little in the way of regulation of this, and so factories produce a great deal of pollution. Moreover, conditions for workers in factories, mills, and coal mines were dirty and unsafe. Poet William Blake in Britain called factories dark, satanic mills. And unfortunately, that wasn't much of an exaggeration. Workers who were hurt or killed on the job simply lost their job with no workers' compensation or disability. Workers had to work very long hours in very monotonous factory jobs. It was physically demanding. Shifts were typically 12, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. And workers were paid very low wages. And as a result of this, many of them had to have their children work as well. So child labor was very common. Workers also lived in dirty slums in these burgeoning cities that were growing so rapidly. They had no indoor plumbing. Entire families were often squeezed into a one-room apartment, very little privacy. Sanitation was terrible. Trash and human and animal waste would be collected or be piled up on the streets. And as the British called them, industrial cities were cesspools. They literally stank. And while this is disgusting on one level, the more important issue is the health impact. The poor sanitary conditions of the Industrial Revolution led to epidemics of terrible diseases. Cholera, fecal matter that contaminates drinking water, killed tens and tens of thousands during the 19th century. Tuberculosis also was a major killer. Poverty led to a number of incredible social problems. Alcoholism was rife. Many poor young women often turned to prostitution simply to survive, and prostitution was rife in many industrial cities such as London, Paris, New York. Venereal diseases, of course, came with this. So there were definitely downsides to the Industrial Revolution. Now, factory owners, managers, bankers, engineers, inventors, they all made a lot of money and did very well during the Industrial Revolution. The benefits of industrialization was uneven, and industrialization created vast inequalities. Now, workers did react against this. I'll give you two examples from Great Britain. Between 1811 and 1813, a group of British workers called the Luddites protested against new machines. Now, they're called the Luddites because they were named after one of their leaders named Ned Ludd. And their real concern was that new machines that were coming online in the textile industry would cause them to lose their jobs. So they actually went around smashing machinery. And we typically think of technology as benefiting people, but technology can sometimes put people out of job. Luddite today refers to someone who's against technology, but the real origin of this were workers fearing losing their jobs. Also, Britain had an important political movement from the 1830s to the 1850s called the Chartist movement, named after their political goals set out in the Charter of 1838. The Chartists, as they were called, mainly focused on making Britain more democratic, with fair elections to Parliament, demanding voting rights for all men, including poor men who did not own property. And a series of voting laws were actually passed that accomplished this. So it gave working class men a greater say in politics. Of course, women are still excluded, and it would only be later until women win the right to vote. So the Chartists did make some gains, particularly voting, and they also spoke out against practices such as wage cuts. So this is the beginning of workers becoming politically and socially active to try to get some of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution for themselves. So let me conclude with a few takeaway points. On the positive side, the early decades of the Industrial Revolution led to the invention of a number of new products and a greater availability of goods. It also led to a growth of cities, as well as better transportation and better communication. Yet the benefits of industrialization came at a terrible cost for workers. While the Industrial Revolution took place over the course of several decades after 1780, it would take many more decades for reform to mitigate some of the worst excesses of industrialization. For better or for worse, however, the Industrial Revolution has come to shape the modern economy and the modern world. Where we live, more in cities today, how we work, more in factories, and the goods available. So I'll stop here. Thanks for watching.